Hi, this is Bob from Hobby Concepts, and today I'm going to use this grand hauler to show how to set up and adjust the steering servo and the shift servo in a Tamiya semi-truck. So I'll go through how to install the arms on them, how to install them in the truck, and how to do mechanical adjustments, and how to adjust servo centering and travel with a radio. So I think this will be a really useful video for setting up your servos. Let's get started. So as I get these servos set up, I've got a servo tester and a little battery for it. I've got the servo tree from the Tamiya kit. I've got a package of servos, and I've got some of the linkages here that I need. You of course can use any servos. I get a lot of questions about servos, and a standard size servo works the best. These are metal geared servos, which I prefer for strength. If you run into something, the gears don't break. And this set also came with a set of servo extensions, which you will need on most trucks because these leads aren't long enough to reach back to the control, the receiver or the MFC. So we'll set that aside, we'll get these aside, we'll talk about this tree. Now this tree has got, these items here are the same, except this is marked Futaba and Tamiya, and this set is marked ACOMS and Sanwa. So the difference is the splines inside here are different, and all you have to do is pick out the set that match your splines, and you can literally just test it by pressing it on the servo. These happen to be the Tamiya and ACOMS set. We're not going to install it yet. I just wanted to make sure I had the right one. So that means these two pieces right here I don't need. I need these two little servo savers. And as I mentioned, I'm going to show every detail of this build here with the servos. A couple of plastic spacer washers here. And the steering arm. Okay, that tree is now empty because I pulled the other parts that were on there off of it, so I can get rid of that. And now it's time to go ahead and set up the servo. So we'll set up the steering servo first. And what I'm going to do is I am going to plug my servo tester in to my battery and plug the servo into the tester. And now I can operate the servo. And if I push a button here, then the tester automatically centers the servo, so I know I'm starting from a place of center. Now you don't specifically need a servo tester, it just makes it a little easier. You could hook it to your speed control and the truck battery and turn on the radio and use that to center it, or turn on the MFC and hook it up and center it. I just like this because I don't need to pull anything else out. So this servo is centered. Now let's look at the steering option. So the steering servo here, we take the shorter, there's a tall, and a short. We take the shorter one and mount it as close as possible to 90 degrees this direction. It may not be exact because of the way the splines are set on the servo. And then one of these spacer rings just snaps on top of that. And then our servo arm is going to fit on there. Before we mount it, we need to put a steering ball in it. So we'll get the steering ball in there. There's a capture nut. Loctite on the ball. and that runs down, tightens up, and this drops on here. Now this particular servo since it has a metal gear, it's got a metal shaft and it's threaded inside with a 3mm hole. Many of the servos use a nylon shaft, and they'll use a tapping screw like this to hold the servo saver on. Since these are threaded, we're going to use a 3mm screw. Now, this package came with 2 different lengths of 3mm screws. Obviously, one is for the shorter steering servo, and one is for the longer shift servo. So I'm going to put a little Loctite on that. Drop in the spacer washer, and then thread this in. Now, since this is an Allen, I'm going to grab an Allen driver. I have the right one here, and we'll tighten that up. And I do not have the right one handy, so we'll use this one. Now, once that's tightened up, the arm turns, but the reason for this plastic ring, it's a shock absorber. Okay, so if the truck were to hit something, this arm would move and separate these a little bit and absorb any impacts. Now, with these metal gear servos, it's really not necessary. You could actually put a metal arm on if you wanted. And sometimes in some trucks, I'll actually wrap a tie wrap around here to make it stronger. But this is a grand hauler, not really necessary. So this servo is now set up. We'll just plug it in here and test it. And you can see that works fine. We'll go ahead and center it again. That one's ready to install in the truck. Now, the shift servo, we'll do the same thing. We'll plug this in to center it. And it has we're going to use the taller servo spacer and get it as close as possible to straight. Right there. We're going to put the servo saver on top of that. We're going to drop in the top part of it. Now, this has an arm that drops in here. It's probably going to be difficult to see on camera, but there's little notches along the side here. And what they do is they allow you to make the arm longer or shorter. Okay, now I'm going to install the ball in this. So this has a little nut that goes in here. Again, tiny bit of Loctite. Now, I have found that for this particular servo, these work best if I line up the notches in the second one in from the end. And I'll put my spacer on there, put a little Loctite on my 3mm threaded screw, and go ahead and install that. Now you can also, once this is in the truck, you still have access to this. You can pull the screw and you can adjust this in and out. So you can set it depending on the amount of travel you have. Modern computer radios, you can also adjust the amount of travel you have with the radio. I like to get everything as close as possible with the servos. We'll test this. Works good. Put it back to the center. So I like to adjust everything mechanically as good as I can. Now, once these are set up, we need to mount them in the brackets for the truck. So our servos are all set up, and they basically mount this direction. The steering servo with this in, shift servo with this out. This mounting bracket has got some bosses that stick up, and they go on the top. We'll start with this screw right here, and there's a screw that has a built-in washer head. And we're going to use the two inside screws. They only give you 4 screws to mount the servos. The servo will just snap over this, and then you can tighten it down. Don't get them super tight here. Then on this one, you do the outside too. So the screws are diagonally opposite. Same thing, you can just snap this on. And tighten it down. Now if you got your truck kit and you don't have the servos, you're going to look at it and go, wow, the first thing I need is servos. I have to order servos, I can't start building my truck. Well, if that's the case, don't fret too much, because you can actually start building the truck. As you can see here, I've got a frame that's all put together except with no servos in it. So the servos will slide in after you built the frame. The steering servo goes on the left side, and these will just slide in here, just pretty as a picture. And I can get a screw. And screw that on. And this forward one has a slot, so whenever they're slotted, I use a screw, and then I put a flat washer under it since it's slotted. They don't show the flat washer on some of the kit instructions. On some of the kits they do. It's not super critical, but the good practice is when there's a slot, use a washer. So there are the servos mounted in the frame. I have to put screws in the other side. So I'll go ahead and put screws in the other side. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mount the suspension, and I'll come back and we'll talk about adjusting the steering. Here you see the servos mounted in the vehicle. Now the next thing I want to do is adjust the tie rod for the steering. And it has these screw-on ends. And in the book, they give you a full-size drawing of the tie rod with the 91mm length. So you can just screw these down until they're 91mm long, and that is a starting point. Now, it's usually pretty close, but what you want to do is have a little bit of toe in. Let's talk about that when I get this to the right length. Okay, so there it is at the right length. Now, the way I like to do this is I like to snap one end on. So I'll snap it on a ball here. And then the other end, before I snap it on, I like to make sure, looking at the axles, that they're actually towed in just a bit. Now, that means that they face this way, okay, towed together. So what I do on my workbench, of course, I've got this nice grid mat, and I can sight down the axle and see what it looks like when I line up the frame one way. And these are these are really close. They're just about straight. So I'm going to loosen this one turn and take a look, and now I have just a tiny bit of toe in that I can actually see. So now I'll snap that back on. Double check everything. So that's how I adjust the steering link. Now the next thing is the steering link from the servo to the arm. And same thing, you've got these ends here. They screw on. And in the book, is a full-size drawing, 28mm long between the ends. And this one usually takes a little more adjustment. Okay, so the way to do this is now to power up the servo and then hook this on. So I could power up the servo with my servo tester, but sometimes the radio and the servo testers are slightly off from each other. You can adjust it later when you get the radio all hooked up, or you can just take a minute, hook up your radio, and power up the servo with that. So that's what I'm going to do. What I've done here is I've used a 10-channel FlySky radio. I've got a battery plugged into a speed control to power the receiver, which is right here, and I've got my steering servo plugged in. So you can see that my servo is now hooked up. Nice thing about it is now I have the exact center that my radio likes. So I'm going to take my steering arm here, snap it on, and then I'm going to adjust this in or out to get my steering straight. Again, a mechanical adjustment. So even though this was adjusted properly according to Tamiya's instructions, it wasn't even close. It's getting closer. There we go. I can snap this on and double check my steering. Looks good. So now I've got my steering adjusted and working, and everything looks good. You can do the fine tuning adjustments in the radio, which we'll get to at the end of it. So the next thing I have to do is hook up my shifting. But before I do that, I've got to get a transmission in the truck. So I'll go back, finish the part of the truck, we'll come back and show how to adjust the shifting, and set the endpoints and make everything absolutely perfect. So as you can see, I've got the transmission mounted, but I do not have the shift rod hooked up. And my steering, of course, is hooked up, and you can see how it operates. So now it's time to adjust the shift. Now, I have hooked the shift servo to this switch right here. So I'm going to have low gear, medium gear, and high gear on a switch. The way I adjust it is I put the servo into second gear, and the transmission then, when you build it, it just floats. So this rod, since it's spring mounted, is going to be in second gear. I'll test it here. Let me see if you can see this. Yeah, you can. So I can actually give it a little throttle, and I can shift it to make sure it's shifting properly, which it's shifting just fine. So now it's in second gear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this rod and hook it to the servo and hook it to the shift pawl on the transmission. And as you can see, it's a little long right now, so I'm going to shorten it by just twisting it. And that's pretty close. A couple more turns, which should be fine. Okay, that looks good. So now we'll snap this on, which is not as easy as it sounds because this thing turns, okay? And then we'll snap it on here. And now it's adjusted. So now, when I go into high gear, it should push all the way in, and the servo shouldn't be working hard, okay? So, for example, if I would make this longer and I'd shift it, the servo might be trying to overdrive it. And I'm going to show you how to fix that in a minute, if that's a problem. So now I'm going to give it a little throttle here. So there's low gear. Now I like to grab onto the drive shaft and give it a little bit of pressure, just to make sure we're shifting fine. Okay, we're shifting good in all three gears. Low, medium, high. Okay, so that's it. This one is set up and the basics are all adjusted and ready to go. You can adjust this at any time. If it's not moving far enough, you can make this longer. If it's moving too far, you can make this shorter. Or you can set the adjustments in the radio, and I'm going to show you how to do that for both the steering and the shifting. So I'm going to show how to adjust this on this FlySky radio, and every computer radio has similar functions, you just might access them differently. So the first one we're going to look at, I'm going to press the menu here, we're going to go over to the function setup menu, and we have two functions that are worth looking at. One of them is endpoints and the other one is subtrim. So let's go down here to subtrim and take a look at that. And you can see each channel has got an arrow right in the middle, and we can adjust it either up or down. And what subtrim does is it adjusts the center point of the servo. So for example, channel 1 is our steering. If the truck is, say, slightly turning off to the left, you can adjust the subtrim a little bit to the right, or vice versa. So that is the final fine-tuning. I suggest you do everything as good as you can mechanically, and then adjust the subtrim only as needed. The second one is endpoints. We'll go up here. And endpoints let you set the end of the servo travel. Now let's say, for example, I hooked that servo up to the shift and it was still driving hard. Now I've got that shift hooked to channel 5. And what we can do is we can adjust. You can see that we have the up position on the switch and the down position on the switch. And we have 100% travel. But let's say that the servo was pushing and it wanted to go a little further. We could actually reduce that travel to, you know, whatever's needed, 80%, 75%, so that the servo doesn't try to keep pushing when the mechanical limits are reached. And since ours came out perfect, we don't need to adjust that. But those are the final adjustments that you can do to the shift. And, for example, if it's not moving enough, let's say it's pulling it almost into gear, but still rattling a little bit, you can actually get more travel to get that final little bit to lock it into gear. So there we go. We have our steering all set up. We have our shifting all set up. Everything's tested, works good. And the only final adjustment I may need to make is the steering. And in order to do that, I'll need to put the truck on the ground and drive it and see if I need to adjust that sub-trim. But that's how you set up and adjust the shift and steering servo. You can see that these are easy to get to with the truck upside down even after it's finished. So you can do all these final setups later on. You can even add the servo horns to the servos later on if you want. So it's not like you have to do it as the very first thing when you build the truck. So there we go. That's how to set up the servos for shifting and steering on a Tamiya semi-truck. This is for the US style. The Euro styles are slightly different, but the setup points remain the same, adjusting the linkages, adjusting the sub-trim. So hey, there you go. Have fun building your Tamiya truck. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Give this video a thumbs up. Those help it in the search rankings. And keep building trucks. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.